All right. Welcome to Gateway Open Office Hours. I'm your host, Carter Laren. This is our 14th episode. I'm here with Ben Larson, my co-host as usual. And today we have a special guest, Jeremy Smith, who's the co-founder of Level One, which was a marketing firm that was acquired. I think they helped build the Chobani yogurt brand from scratch, Crave, a whole bunch of brands that you would recognize. And now he's just launched Launchpad, just started Launchpad. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I should remind everyone, if you want to be informed when we go live, please go ahead and follow us on Facebook, and click the follow button. You get informed when we go live, and I guess you can follow us on Twitter. The Twitter handle is at the bottom of your screen there, GTWIINC, or you can tweet us questions at GatewayOH or hashtag GatewayOH, and we will try and answer them and give you a shout out. But someone asked a question about consumer packaged goods this week, and so
was Wes Martin, right?
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
All right, Wes. Hey, Wes. Wes asked about CPG stuff this week, so we went and got Jeremy, who is one of our best mentors, I think, and also you had I guess a brief advisory relationship with Kamala, one of our brands, when they really needed help, kind of on the rebranding early on. So, yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? I'd like to hear a little bit about Launchpad if you want to chat about it.
Sure. It's brand new. It's not official yet. It will be official, up and running hopefully by Monday. No website yet, but my main focus has been working with smaller emerging brands over the years. We started Level One in 2006, co-founded the company with my brother, and our focus was to help companies like Chobani, which when we met them, they really were an emerging brand. They're almost $2 billion now, but I think they were around a couple 100,000 in sales when we met. I think it was around 2007, and they had 5 to 7 employees, so it was a really small organization. And their goal was to get into Costco. They had 2 paths to get into retail. One was with a set of brokers. Lots of people work with brokers. Some go direct, but we really specialize in Costco because of the volume. And so we've worked with brands from Chobani to Crave Jerky to Bob's Red Mill, and we're just specialized in really the Costco retail set, but we also help our companies from business strategy, and that's really what I'm focusing on with the new company, is to make sure that the companies, once they're thinking of going to Costco, that I come in and help them with their strategy. Some of them, I help them with their branding and their marketing and their packaging design, because there's a lot of ways to go to Costco, and most of them are not successful, and the system's really broken. There's like billion-dollar companies that will help you get into Costco, and they charge massive retainer fees, and they're not really geared towards working with emerging brands. So the focus of my new company is going to be exclusively on emerging brands. Costco for the first probably 6 to 7 months, 8 months, and then I'm talking to some other people that I'll probably launch full retail services probably somewhere around 6 to 10 months after we get some of the clients that we have already up at Costco.
So we're super excited to have you on.
Thank you.
When you talk emerging brands, I mean, that is the cannabis industry. And that's why Wes actually reached out to us, because, well, besides he himself being an emerging brand, that's all that the cannabis industry has. There is no Pepsi. There is no Coke. What have you seen? What has been your observation? I know you kind of been a little bit on the outside, getting more involved recently. What's your observations of what's out there today and where the industry is heading?
Food or marijuana?
Marijuana.
Marijuana is at an interesting stage because I happen to have started early in that when I was 10 years old. What year was it? 69. My mom was one of the first people in our neighborhood to actually have a fairly substantial half-acre growing in Weston, Connecticut of marijuana. And back then, if you got caught, you're talking about 10 to 15-year jail sentences for a half a pound. I mean, they were.
Go mom.
Yeah, it was risky, but she was a free spirit and didn't care. But today, I think we're getting to the point. It's very much like the internet. When the internet first started, and AOL was just launching and CompuServe was there. It was kind of this wild west. You couldn't get a real email address. You had to be something like 1354.8532. Marijuana's sort of been in that phase, and it's now about to become commercialized as the legalization spreads, and hopefully in California on Tuesday it will become legalized. And then the question comes, how do the companies that exist today transition into trusted brands? Because if you're really going to attract the consumers, they have to trust your brand. And I think a lot of the smaller brands today that aren't well known are going to struggle in the beginning, because immediately there will be people that will get into this category that are very good at marketing and creating standards. Because in the food industry cannot succeed without standards. They're very important. And I think that's what's going to happen with the marijuana industry. It's very exciting. And I think that we are now, I think in the next year or two at the most, we're at the real launch phase of when this is going to become a serious business. I'd really love to come back in 10 years and see where it goes, because I think this is something that's long overdue, and it's going to get beyond where it was just a medical thing for so long. Well, it helps me with glaucoma, so I go get a prescription, you run down there, and before you know it, people are writing, everyone says they have glaucoma so that they can legally smoke pot, and it shouldn't be that way.
You talked about kind of like marketing being a key to some of these brands, like winning out the quote unquote brand war. Cannabis industry is interesting because there's not a lot of the traditional advertising channels. I think a lot of the brands today are leaning a lot on social, and I think there have been some brands that you've worked with that have really leveraged social to grow quickly. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I hate always going back to Chobani, because it sounds like a broken record, but no one.
It's a good record, though.
It is a very good record.
Not to this audience. We've only mentioned it 3 times.
So it's a gold record. I mean, they made a decision to not go the traditional advertising route, and they went all social media for, I think it was the first 3 or 4 years. And if you go back and look at Chobani Greek yogurt, you would have, anyone who would have said, well, I'm going to start a Greek yogurt company, I'm competing against Fage, Dannon, and all these huge billion-dollar companies, but I'm not going to advertise. I'm going to use social media to reach and build my brand. They would have laughed you out. No one would have given you $1, and they would have said, hey, it's too big a category. You can't compete against these guys. And the team at Chobani said, no, we're going to use social media in a way that is different. And they're truly the only food company that I've seen that was able to use social media to build a $1 billion brand. Now, I think it was around 300 million or 200 million. They did start to blend traditional advertising in, but they had tremendous support. And I always have people come to me, make me the next Chobani. And I laugh because I said, first of all, you got to be who you are. You can't be Chobani, and you're not going to do what they did. I mean, it was a huge commitment. They had somebody on their website almost 24 hours a day supporting the people that would come to the Facebook page or social media. And if someone in Biloxi said there's no stores that have Chobani, they'd ship them some, and then tell them, go into your grocers and request us and get us, help get us set up. And that was a big part of it, because as Chobani grew and became a much more traditional CPG company, they were then attacked, as always happens, because as the there's people that love the company when it's really small, and then the competitors start coming after them really hard. And so, but what you see on social media is, because Chobani has built up such goodwill with consumers, that Chobani doesn't have to fight any of the attacks, because the people on social media who are loyal to the brand do all of the talking for them, and that's, there's no better voice than people who are original versus traditional marketing that you might use to counteract that. And so that allowed Chobani to establish themselves as a real, not a CPG company, but as a emerging brand that always remained emerging, and that connection with the consumer. And that's why they're getting close to 2 billion now, is that they've still been able to do that while constantly innovating. They've got a lot of good people there, and that's going to have to happen in the marijuana space, because as you broaden your base into traditional consumers, what's going to happen is people are going to have higher expectations on edibles, because they're used to eating a baked good. So if they buy a brownie, they expect it to taste like a high-end brownie that they're used to eating. They're not buying it just because there's pot in it. It better tastes good. And so I think there's going to be that evolutionary point where a lot of the companies that are just using baked goods as a transportation method to get pot, they're going to have to step their game up, because as the market grows and there are large-scale standards, and larger co-packers will come into this market and try and take advantage of it, there's going to be a lot of competition. And there are a lot of companies out there in the baked goods world that know how to make great baked goods, and marijuana is just another ingredient. They're working with hundreds of ingredients every day, and I think it's going to revolutionize the market. I think 5 years from now, you'll walk into a Safeway and you'll say, these are the best brownies you've ever had, or whatever the baked good is, a cookie, and they go, oh yeah, and they also have this grade of marijuana in it, and then you're like, really? I just buy them because it's a great baked good.
Do you think bigger players? I mean, I think right now it's the federal status of cannabis that kind of prevents the big players from coming in. Do you think that there's kind of medium-sized players that are more local that will jump in, that maybe have a brand that maybe is in California, for example, and if it passes, assuming that it passes, will kind of jump in and use their expertise to brands we're not thinking of that aren't cannabis brands?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of regional brands, like Sugar Bowl Bakery is a good example of. And I don't want to imply that Sugar Bowl Bakery is getting into the marijuana business, because I know those folks. But Sugar Bowl was a very small bakery in San Francisco several years ago, probably about 10 years ago. They were much smaller. Now they're a national brand, but they're a good example of there's thousands of regional bakeries that produce fantastic products, that if you travel, like when you go into Texas, you'll find a brand. If you're in Chicago, you'll find these incredible cupcakes that a company makes. You go to LA, you'll find something else. And so, yes, there are these smaller regional brands that will have the ability to get into it. And if the bill, which I assume at this point, I haven't seen the latest numbers, that it will pass in California. California is a host to, up and down the state, thousands of fantastic bakeries that could leverage this opportunity, because you have to remember that you can only do so much as a bakery. Once you've done your brownies or whatever your specialty is, there's you got to look for other opportunities to grow your business, and I think those companies will look at that as an opportunity. Now, you also have to have distribution to match that. Those companies won't get into it if Safeway says, I'm not getting into it, or Molly Stone's doesn't get into it. So, there's also layers of retail, and I would think that most of the specialty brands start out in the Berkeley Bowls of the world, and so I would think these products will probably hit there first. But there also have to be standards so that you can produce something that they're not going to have a recall on, or there's going to be fundamental problems with in the beginning. I think that's going to start out a little bit slower. I think Safeway will probably get it into get into it much later. And when I say later, maybe 4 or 5 years out, but I could definitely see a year from now, 2 years from now, some of the bakeries getting into this and selling, these type of products at Berkeley Bowl.
So you think I'm not sure about like when someone like Berkeley Bowl would go and get a license, because you still have to get a license, right? So you think some of the smaller retail establishments might go after this and just add cannabis to their repertoire?
Well, some of them technically, if they wanted to, could make it in-house. You're going to have probably a 2 to 4 year period where the retailers and the distributors and the companies that are currently making the products are going to figure out how do we move forward before we move forward. And so I think once you get there, once people see what the market is, I think things will generally move at a much quicker pace. And once the business takes off, then you have the ugly world of lobbyists. And if there's money to be made, lobbyists will come in and work with marketing organizations to make sure that the path to with regulations gets reduced as much as possible, so that I would think at some point they'll probably remove the licensing that a retailer would have to get licensed. As soon as there's money changes everything, both good and bad. I mean, a lot of people will be upset at some point 5-6 years from now when some of the smaller brands that they're working with aren't around anymore. They could get acquired. I mean, money and market dynamics change everything, and that's why you see in the food industry today, many of the emerging brands, Crave got acquired by Crave Jerky got acquired by Hershey's. Justin's just got bought a few months ago by another company. So you're going to see all of those same things happen as this market grows. And I think it's really an exciting time, because once California has always really been the leader, from smog regulations to EPA regulations to if you look at the automotive industry, California is really what all the California standards are what all the automotive companies adopted, and then once you meet California standards, you meet everything. So I think the same thing will happen in this industry, and the players that are the companies that are the most excited and really want to make money at this and get out of it being somewhat of a hobby will then work with the politicians to pass laws to move this thing forward much faster.
Interesting.
So I think there's a lot of young brands, small brands in the industry that have a lot of anxiety about kind of legalization and how they might get pushed out. But there's a lot that they can do that, the exit opportunity is actually really interesting, and maybe people aren't as familiar with it, and that's maybe why they have so much anxiety about it. Say I have a young brand or starting a new, CPG company. This is a big, very open-ended question, but like, what's the process I should go to make sure that I'm starting to build a brand that could be recognized and build my own place? You mentioned being yourself and having that core value, and what we actually often run through is a brand foundation study, that includes all the naming and all that. What's kind of the process that you go through with new brands? Feel free to dig into it or stay as shallow as you want.
Okay, so when I first started in this business in 2005, 2006 with Level One, we used to chase brands all over the place. Oh, this is a great food product and it's fantastic, and then the client would never get to the point where we could go to Costco with it. And so we changed our model, and I've definitely looked at that in forming Launchpad, is that I don't invest in brands anymore. I invest in people, because a good management team with the right product, as Chobani or Crave or Bob's Red Mill, will make the difference in over a period of time. A lot of the smaller companies are are going to need to look at the larger opportunity and say, where do we want to be in 4 or 5 years? And I don't know how many of those companies think that way, because you look at a market like California, and it's been underdeveloped for so long. So your big picture, what is the potential long term, was somewhat limited until legalization happens. And so hopefully at some point, one of the things that will spur this thing along is, and again, I think if the legislation passes on the ballot, then the federal government may get involved and just do a complete decriminalization, and that would really help. But if I was an entrepreneur of one of these companies, the first thing I would do is sit down and analyze my brand, and they may not want to spend a lot of money working with a good design firm, but a good branding and design firm can come in and help you understand the market, and that's critical. And a lot of these companies don't really have sales teams, and I think they're going to have to look at, how do you build an infrastructure? Do I use brokers? Do I have a VP of sales? And they're going to have to start planning. Otherwise, they're not going to be players over a long period of time, because as the business grows, you have to keep up with what's happening. And so a lot of these companies will need structure that they may not currently have. And in order to do that, they're probably going to have to start looking at running their companies less like a hobby and more like a real business. And if they don't, there will be companies that come into this market that understand this right away, and will start putting teams together of people that have all of that have, at some point, if this market takes off, people will come in and start hiring people from CPG companies, that come in and build a team as it grows, just like any food company. And if you look at how the emerging brands start, it almost always, in the food business, it starts with an entrepreneur and an idea. And he or she may then, take their product, and they'll usually roll into somebody like a Berkeley Bowl and a Whole Foods, and they'll start small and they'll start doing that. And then they'll slowly get to the $1 million range, and that's where they start to get a little bit excited. And then the next phase is maybe 5 or 8 million. And as you start to grow the company, no entrepreneur can do it by themselves. You have to put structure in place. You can't do things by the seat of your pants anymore, because once you start building a company without infrastructure, chaos will emerge, and before you know it, either your competition will pass you, or unfortunately you'll mismanage your business. And so I do agree, though, what you said earlier, that some people are not going to be happy about the change. I still miss the old internet, where ads weren't following you around, and you could actually search for things, and no one directed you to ads. And like, if you wanted to look for something from 1966, it was much easier to find than it is today, because Google directs you to where they want you to go. But that's the evolution of the internet. That I probably sound ancient now just talking about that, because everyone's just happy that they can buy a pair of shoes online, and tickets and everything else, and fly anywhere they want. So there's a lot of great benefits to it. But yes, there will be people that will feel like, I remember the good old days, and when the government wasn't there. And if you look at the organic industry, there's a lot of that there. There are companies that refuse to put the USDA organic logo, which I'm sure there will be a USDA logo at someday, or something from the federal government, some sort of stamp of approval. But there are a lot of companies that won't put the USDA logo on, because they don't like what the CPG companies have done in lowering the standards in some areas on organic. And so that's a whole nother discussion for another time.
So you mentioned kind of a more sophisticated, built-out marketing strategy and approach. Is that something that's capitally intensive that you think that, if you're a startup in the marijuana space now, in the CPG marijuana space now, should you be really budgeting for a lot bigger marketing push than you would normally?
Well, if it were me, I would. But if you're a local small company in Berkeley, you may have for the next 5 to 6 years be able to survive just, continually servicing who you service. The question then becomes, when the opportunities come along, if you haven't built up your brand, you haven't put the structure in place, and you haven't thought through, long term where you want to be, then when opportunities come, they pass you by. I mean, you can walk into Berkeley Bowl today, and I keep using Berkeley Bowl because I think it's a real funky place. That's a throwback as a market. It's kind of, goes back to almost the old hippie markets that you used to go into. Well, at least I did. I'm older than you guys, but where you'd find things that you couldn't find at the traditional supermarket. And so I think there'll always be some of that. And like you'll see brands at Berkeley Bowl and even at Whole Foods that you don't see anywhere else because they've said, I don't want to be more than $1 million or $2 million company. And then somebody comes in and takes away a lot of their business, but they still survive enough to stay there. Eventually, this will be the type of business as there are more doors, if you will, to get into retail wise, that capital will be much more readily available to people. And I think that's great because anytime capital can flow into markets, you just look at the food industry again with emerging brands. When capital started flowing and the venture capital firms and the private equity saw that get away from the Pepsis and the Campbell's soups, get into the smaller brands that are going, like Hope Foods out of Colorado, that are going to be the next big thing or are the next big thing. They could make a lot of money over a short period of time because these companies sometimes grow at 150 to 400% a year. So as to where in today's market, and this is why like a Campbell's soup, and you see all of these CPG companies buying these brands because their new reality is 2% growth, which isn't good for shareholders. So nobody wants to buy a stock in a company that only has 2% growth. So you'll see all of these companies setting up their own private equity groups. Like General Mills has 301 Inc., which I think they've done one of the best jobs at separating the culture. But they're going out and buying these smaller companies because one of the things that you can learn from the larger CPGs is structure and how to build infrastructure. And it's been very helpful to some of the smaller brands. And if you look at Epic, for example, which really has now gotten into bars and jerky and other things beyond what their normal single line products was. It's a completely different company with really exciting products because they now have leverage to capital and through Kellogg's distribution. Stacy's Pita Chips was another brand that they got acquired by Frito-Lay Pepsi, and they became a ginormous brand. They never could have grown as fast as they did otherwise because Pepsi just throws them on a distribution route with Frito-Lay, and all of a sudden now they're in 5,000 stores instead of 2,000. All of these things will come to the marijuana industry if it takes off and as successful as I think it will be.
So you brought up venture capital, private equity. You're an advisor with Circle Up,
Yep.
Which is a pretty well-known, CPG venture capital. When they're making investments, what are they looking for in a company? Like what stage of growth, what kind of traction are they looking at?
Right.
What type of companies are coming through there and being successful with their raises?
Well, it's interesting. You look at a company like Smari, which is Icelandic yogurt, and they were able to raise money through there because they already had distribution. The companies that struggle when they go in there are the ones that may have a fantastic idea, but they have no distribution. And if you don't have distribution to start, it's harder to get somebody to invest because to them it's really unproven. But if you can say, hey, here's a year or two of sales, even if they're you're under $1 million, if you can show the year over year growth and that you're expanding out, then investors will look at it because it's a tricky market for food companies and companies in general because most of the emerging brands, and that's why Circle Up has been so successful. Most of the VMGs of the world generally are looking at a sweet spot of about starting. They want to see a company at 10 million, and there's to start. That's generally I don't want to speak for everybody there, but generally 10 million in sales. That really, if somebody gets to 10 million, that means they have enough infrastructure. They're in a good place. They do have a business that somebody like VMG could help and advise and invest and get them to 50 or 100. When you're under that, and there are more and more companies coming into the space, it's much riskier because you get a company that has, let's say they do $1.5 million in sales, 30% of that's from Costco, the rest is from retail. They generally don't have a high, a strong management structure. Some do, some don't, but a lot of them don't. They're still at that stage of really trying to get to the next level, so they're caught in between that 10 million, under the 10 million, where they can't go to VMG if they wanted to. So the Circle Ups really help these companies, and the other advantage is right now, if you're looking for money, is because there's not a lot of places for growth other than the stock market, because you can't get 5 or 6% at a bank anymore, or T-bills or anything like that. Those days are gone. So a lot of investors who have made money over the years use Circle Up as a way to pump capital and hopefully get a better return than they would get anywhere else. So I think as long as the interest rates stay low, Circle Up is going to be an important part of the business. But then so Circle Up helps you get funding if you need it at a certain level, and then after that, that's where you got to put the accelerator down and really start to build your company.
So when you're getting kind of that earlier, I guess what I would say earlier stage funding, some of the next steps would be like doing the key hires to structure your management team, ensuring that you have the solid distribution, and just kind of pushing towards like that 10 million in sales.
Yeah, exactly. And brokers are a big part of that, and that's something there are no, as far as I'm aware of, there are no like the food industry has thousands of brokers that help retail companies, brands get into retailers. That whole network is not established yet for marijuana brands, but that's something like if you're an edible brand, that would be very easy for the existing brokers to be able to work with, because if they're already selling baked goods, you're just selling a baked good with pot in it now. So once the retailers are either licensed or there's a quick process for them to go into to get SKU space, then I think that market will open up to them. Now, the other thing that could happen is that the smaller dispensaries could become larger, and that they could almost become the Berkeley Bowls for the next 5 to 6 years. And that's where people go to get their baked goods if those companies know how to market themselves right. So there's a lot of things that have to happen, and I don't think anyone really truly has an answer as to what's going to happen. But I can just say from people that I know, when I come home with edibles, people get kind of excited.
So, go ahead.
I would just follow up with it. I'd throw some kudos out to Kiva. They make a wonderful chocolate bar that has been widely received, and they've leveraged that to get into over, I think, 900 dispensaries. I think was the last number I heard in
That's
California.
Great. Yeah.
So they're kind of leveraging that as a new way to get distribution.
There's someone who's building a brand that's going to be accessible to the mainstream as well, right?
And then also a distribution opportunity for new emerging brands. Like if if they find you interesting, maybe you can ride their coattails.
Yeah, I'd like to see at some point, so let's assume California, it's legalized. I think at some point, somewhere, somebody would need to it would be a good idea to bring the states together in some way to support the dispensaries, so that if, like you're talking about with that bar, there's an easier regulatory way for them to be able to get their products distributed at dispensaries in Colorado, in Oregon, Washington, and other places as more and more become legalized.
So, you know, we're talking a lot about kind of the mainstream CPG world right now, or we have.
Right.
Is there something other than the legal status of cannabis that you think is preventing the mainstream CPG people from coming into cannabis? Or is it just the legal status?
No, I don't think it's just the legal status. I think there's a huge trust factor here. When kale chips first came out, people didn't rush to buy them because, a lot of, and I'm talking about the mainstream consumer, because there's always early adopters, but, people, what do they taste like? I don't know. So if you're a traditional consumer, your first question is going to be with an edible, well, how do I trust this brand? I've never heard of it before. And I think because one of the downsides of only being at the dispensaries is that a lot of people have, from a consumer standpoint, have a negative view. It's kind of like buying, when the VCRs, when CD players came out and then DVD players came out. There were only, when it first came out, there was only one real brand. I think it was Philips and then Sony, and there wasn't a lot of distribution because it was such a new technology. So there were retail stores that really didn't have great reputations, but they carried them all immediately. And then once everything took off, then the Good Guys, which isn't around anymore, brought them all in and all that stuff. I think that's going to be, the challenge. But just like any industry, you go back to the food industry, when it started, it had all of the same challenges. One of the advantages, though, I do think that the dispensaries have is they do have good local vibe, and that's really important because that's how you build trust. And one of the things I've noticed with the samples I've brought home for the edibles is that there's a group of people that I found out that I had no idea they were buying edibles. So they were all like, well, let me try these and compare them to what I'm getting. So when my daughter was talking to me about it, I didn't realize she sounded like an expert. She knew a ton about it. So she was telling me, well, no, they should use this ingredient. Da, 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 da. So there are people like that. The question is, how do we get to the next level where this becomes much more mainstream? And I think that's really going to be the challenge for the entire industry, because the industry has to be able to go out there and say, this is how we're going to build it. We want to make it mainstream, and we want to go beyond the handful of states that we have. And we don't want to get into a situation where it's still kind of almost like a closed kind of a hidden environment. The big thing, I still think, because of California's play in the rest of the country, they're going to have a big say because of the size of California and how things pan out. And so I think things, if it's legalized in California, will push regulations and distribution and push dispensaries to come out from kind of the closets. And I remember Willie Brown was on this was years ago when he was mayor, and he was on KFOG, which was a rock and roll station back then. Now I don't even recognize it, but I think it was Clinton was president, and they had a raid on the dispensaries in San Francisco and closed them. And Willie was kind of upset, and the DJ asked him, well, what are you going to do? And he says, well, Willie said, and you can only do this in San Francisco, because if any other mayor had said this, they would have been impeached. But he said, oh, don't worry, I knew it was coming. I got my stash. But we have to be able to get away from that, where people don't look at it that way. And I think, I really think, with hemp products, that's, hemp seeds are mainstream. So I don't know if I'm going to see a bag of Bob's Red Mill marijuana seeds or anything like that in the very near future, but maybe 10 years from now.
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds like you're saying, on the one hand, the dispensaries may have an advantage because they have that local vibe, and if they can really capitalize on the brand and expand it, they can do that. But it sounds like also on the other hand, some of the major brands may have an advantage, and they already have trust with consumers. So if they do venture into the cannabis space, they can capitalize on their brand recognition and trust.
Exactly, and I think the dispensaries they're going to need to hire firms and become brand, really get their brand out there and be a trusted resource, and they have a role to play because the more that they're trusted, the more it's not this kind of secret world that some people understand. I always remember the word associated with the pot industry, marijuana industry for so long was, people would say, and again I'm dating myself, hey, I need to score some, and we got to get away from scoring. You have to be able to, it's almost like you still, because of how stupid for so many years this decriminalization was, instead of just going federal and just decriminalizing the whole thing, it's like you almost always have to ask a parent, oh yeah, you got to go to the doctor, and then you got to get a prescription for this and that, and the food industry would have never grown if yes, I need a prescription to go buy some jerky, and you have to go to your doctor, get online. It's stupid, and as more and more people understand how valuable from a health perspective pot is, and I think more and more states are going to open it up, and then the federal government will step in, and then you'll really see some change, because then there'll be a huge market opportunity, and when there's a huge market opportunity, everybody comes.
So you want to just be able to add it to your grocery list.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I don't think we need to ask what you're voting on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Oh, I already voted.
Yeah.
Oh,
Good.
there you go.
Yeah, there you go. I
Well,
of
look,
course voted yes.
I don't want to. I think we're past our target stop time. So really, again, want to thank you for joining us. It was an awesome discussion.
Oh, anytime.
Really appreciated it. Ben, do you have anything to add before we
Yeah,
wrap up?
I'm excited for the next stage of your professional career.
Thank you.
Level 1 did some amazing things. You must
Yes.
be proud as a co-founder of that.
Yes.
Launchpad, we're excited to see the new website coming soon. Check the comments. We will be posting there as soon as that's ready. And
Maybe we'll bring you back after that's a little bit more
yeah.
established and ready, and
And
have
I
Thank
know
you.
post Prop 64 vote. And see
There you go.
Yeah.
And I know the founders of Good and Somatic are excited to meet you, and
Thank you.
we're excited to get you involved in the next program.
Absolutely.
That's great. So we got a big election. So last thing I'll say, make sure you get out and vote.
Yes.
All
For
right.
Prop 64. Definitely.
We won't talk about the rest.
Yeah, well, at least vote for Prop 64.
That's right.
So, look, thanks everyone, and we will see you all next week. Remember, you can follow us at GTWI Inc., which should be at the bottom of your screen, or follow us on Facebook to get a notification when we live stream. But it'll be at 10 a.m. Pacific time next Friday. Thanks.
Yeah. All right.